Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. My name is Danny Hamilton. I'm so thankful you're joining me. And on today's episode, we are going to speak with a brilliant man, Dr. Gregory Kelly, all about how to age better. There are about 12, I think now, hallmarks of aging, and there are all sorts of things that make our cells age worse. I don't know about you, but I don't want to age poorly. I want to look good. I want to feel good. I want to have energy. I want my joints to feel good. And so this is a new topic that I'm really excited to dive into. I've said before, I'm 38. I'm looking 40 in the face. And it's time for me to start thinking about these things. But perhaps you're a little older than I am. And maybe you're like, yeah, give me all the anti-aging hacks because I want to look better, feel better, and perform better. So let me tell you about Gregory and what we talked about on this podcast today. So we discussed hallmarks of aging. We talked about these things called senescent cells. They're also called zombie cells. And I was really surprised at how these things impact our health and where it shows up in your body when you have high levels of these senescent cells. We talk about how to get rid of them, and we talk about their impact on blood sugar, metabolism, and even at the end, we really started diving into certain concepts about circadian rhythms and even how things like seasonality and timing and light can start impacting some of these concepts as well. We talk about a couple more supplements from Qualia, which is this amazing brand of supplements. And I was really just like kind of on the edge of my seat this whole time listening to this stuff because all of this is new for me and I find it to be so fascinating. I think that sometimes when we can talk about stuff that has to do with the cells, it doesn't feel as like, oh wow, that's a big deal because we don't feel stuff that happens at the cellular level. But what I am understanding is that when things happen to our cells, to our mitochondria, which are in our cells, that's where the disease process is starting. So we recognize when things are a problem, when we have symptoms. The cells have already been reeling for a long time before we get symptoms. So I know a lot of you are in this space and listening to this podcast because you know that you don't want to be reactionary. You don't want to just develop a disease or a problem and then take a pill for it. You want to be also preventing things and living a really healthy lifestyle to turn on the best possible genes for you and to just move through life in a better way. And a lot of this comes down to taking care of our cellular health. I feel like it's not as sexy, it's not as fun, but it's freaking important and it's really cool. And so I told him that my audience is full of probably people who have not heard much about aging. And so he made it really accessible to me, who I don't know about aging. So I'm like, I don't know about aging stuff. I don't know about all this stuff about cells. So he made it really listener friendly. And he's just a brilliant man. So listening to him speak was, hi Copper. Was really interesting. So let me read his bio. Gregory Kelly is VP of Product Development. Sorry, my cat is literally walking across my computer. This is really professional. Gregory Kelly is VP of Product Development at Neurohacker Collective, and he is a naturopathic physician and author of the book Shape Shift. He was the editor of the journal Alternative Medicine Review and has been an instructor at the University of Bridgeport in the College of Naturopathic Medicine, where he taught classes in advanced clinical nutrition, counseling skills, and doctor-patient relationships. Dr. Kelly has published hundreds of articles on natural medicine nutrition, contributed 3 chapters to the textbook Natural Medicine. He has more than 30 journal articles indexed on Pubmed. You guys, I told you he was freaking brilliant. His areas of expertise include nootropics, anti-aging, and regenerative medicine, weight management, sleep, and the chronobiology of performance and health. That chronobiology is about time and light. And so we did start to dive into some of these more topics about light and circadian rhythm and things towards the end, like I mentioned. And we also do tie this back to our metabolic health. So I really hope that you enjoy this episode. I put all sorts of links in the show notes if you want to check out some of these supplements that we do talk about on the show. I am super excited for you guys to dive into this episode. Let's head into the interview with Dr. Gregory Kelly. Dr. Gregory Kelly, thanks so much for being here. Excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm excited to share some cool things with your listeners.
Yeah, so I think the best place we should start is understanding what is kind of the life cycle of a healthy cell. Like, what should a cell do in its life and how should it come to an end?
Sure. So, if you were to Google it for listeners, you'll see something to the effect of an average cell lives about 7 years. But that average is crazy, like all over the place. So, we have some cells that line our intestines that live, in months. Liver cells about 1 to 3 years. Heart cells about 4 decades. And our neurons are meant to last a lifetime. So depending on the tissue, the lifespan of a cell varies tremendously. So cells, just like us, they're, birthed from parent cells. Usually they're copied, right? Like that's mitosis is the term for it. So they're kind of clones, if you want to think of it that way. And then they live and die. And like I said, the average lifespan in tissues varies a lot. And towards the end of their life, they go through what's thought of as programmed cell death. And they use the idea of programmed because it's almost like in advance of them dying, the cell starts to get ready for it. And that's the term for that is apoptosis, which comes from a Greek word, because a lot of medicine things do. And that apoptosis means something along the lines of falling off, but in the sense of a fruit falling off a tree or a leaf falling off a plant. So they like literally almost fall off our tissues. And what that means is they just break apart and disintegrate. And then the immune system comes in and gobbles up that debris and puts it back to good use to grow more new and healthy cells. So that's kind of what it does. But just like us, cells can get stressed. They can, have things that cause them to age prematurely. And so we'll talk a little bit about that because, there's healthy cells and there's stress cells and they can behave very differently.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And so what happens if things go wrong? Like, what is this idea? I heard this term cellular senescence. And what happens with a cell when that is going on?
Yeah, so senescence is from the same root we would get senile, right? It just means aging. And cellular senescence is cell aging. And in 2014, some scientists got together and said, well, all right, whether it's flies, mice, rats, monkeys, humans, they seem to have characteristics in common as they age. Think of these more as like the mechanism or the underlying drivers of aging. And one of those is cellular senescence. But how that is usually meant is cells that have become old enough or worn out enough that they're not allowed to make clone cells. So they no longer divide. So when you hear the idea of cellular senescence, think old, stressed, worn out cell, but also think of, these cells are kind of frozen. They're not cells that are allowed to make children anymore because you don't want to create damaged children, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So does the body not get rid of them then? Do they not have this apoptosis happening?
Yeah. So there's senescent cells would be the name of the cells that have undergone cellular senescence. And when we're 20, they're short-lived. So, we maybe if we ran a marathon, we would make a bunch of senescent cells, but they would go through apoptosis, just like healthy cells at the end of their useful lifespan. And if one's missed that, the immune system would try to find the stragglers and round them up. And what happens with aging, and I tend to think of those young senescent cells as transient. And what happens as we get older is they linger. So they've figured out ways to resist going through apoptosis. And the immune system also gets old and gets less good at finding all kinds of stress cells. And so that combination is why you see that idea of cellular senescence or senescent cells in aging, because as we get older, these ones that should have, like the way I would think of it, fallen off the plant didn't. They're it's like stuck in our tissues and gradually accumulating. And with the passage of time, sometimes that gradual accumulation turns more into like a snowball rolling downhill, and it's an exponential increase in those types of cells in our tissues.
Wow. Okay. So let me sum up because this is new to me and it may be new to my listeners that typically a healthy cell has this programmed cell death at the end called apoptosis. And during that cell's lifetime, it divides, it replicates. But then there's cells that get so old that they're basically not allowed to replicate anymore because maybe there would be some damage or they're just too old to do that. And when you're young, your immune system comes in, clears away these things, these cells, and most often they go through the apoptosis. But as we age, our immune system also ages, and these cells sort of linger and start to form more of an issue, and that contributes to us aging more poorly.
Yeah, so it's that would be then a characteristic of aging, that we
Okay.
accumulate more and more of these senescent cells in all kinds of tissues. And then most of the things, like I know your audience is big into metabolic health and things
Yeah.
related to managing glucose. A lot of that would be caused by these types of cells accumulating in fat tissue or the pancreas, right? And then causing issues with regulating blood sugar and insulin and all these other things that tie in with metabolic health and metabolic regulation.
So senescent cells can cause issues with metabolic health in this
Oh
way.
yeah,
Is that's what we're saying?
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Almost any poor outcome with aging, senescent cells are at least like hovering in the vicinity and contributing to it. There may be other things contributing as well, but they're without question in an aging context, they're one of the big players.
Wow. So why do they cause such an issue?
Yeah. So
I feel like that's a
the,
real broad question, but it's
yeah,
like, yeah, they seem to be so problematic, but I can't really wrap my head around how.
yeah. So there's three general characteristics of senescent cells. And one of those we already mentioned, they resist going through apoptosis. So they basically are figuring out a way to hang out long after
Oh.
I think of it as their use by date. Long after that, they're still there. So that's one. Number two is what I mentioned to start. There's cells that no longer make offspring, right? They've stopped from dividing, which, dividing is a characteristic of healthy cells. So these are, they're not dead, they're not healthy, they're trapped somewhere in no man's land between, which is part of the reason they're sometimes referred to as zombie cells. And then the third reason is they secrete all kinds of compounds out into the environment around them, often thought of as the microenvironment. And some of those are inflammatory molecules. A lot of them are inflammatory molecules. And those molecules can change the behavior of nearby cells. And fundamentally, what they do, and again, part of the reason the idea of zombie fits, is they can take healthy cells and turn them into prematurely aged senescent cells. That's part of the reason it's that cascading or snowball
Yeah.
effect. And part of the reason it ties in with so many different things with aging is because of those compounds they're secreting that are just, inflammaging is a big thing as we get older, and senescent cells are, putting out a lot of the inflammaging molecules into our tissues.
Wow, that is very interesting. So, what are some other hallmarks of aging? Because you've mentioned a couple of those, and so we can grasp sort of this whole picture that's happening as we age.
Yeah, so originally there was 9 proposed, now they're up to 12 as of the beginning of 2023. Um, so telomere attrition. So telomeres are basically the caps on the ends of our DNA, and if each time our DNA copies itself, that cap gets shorter and shorter, and if it gets too short, then we don't want to copy it anymore because it could introduce damage. So it used to
Okay.
be thought, like originally, that was what was thought as the only reason that cells became senescent was because of telomeres getting shorter. So that's one. Another is think of DNA damage. So that would be referred to as genomic instability. But basically, our genome isn't as copied as crisply as we get older. There was a movie with Michael Keaton years and years ago called Multiplicity, and he kept making clones, and kind of one of the lines in it was a copy of a copy of a copy isn't as crisp as the original. So we want to, make sure we don't have that happen, right? So that's
Right.
the DNA one. Another one would have to do with our stem cells getting exhausted. So what would naturally happen? You asked about cells' life cycles. When cells die off, if clones don't replace them, then stem cells create brand new cells that fill that space in tissues, right? But as we get older, stem cells get what's thought of as exhausted. They don't do that job as well anymore. Then mitochondria dysfunction is another one. So our mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of our cells, get a little bit worn out. Other ones include what's called, it has to do with folding and unfolding of proteins. So the workhorses inside our cells are proteins. And to get through membranes, to get through, from outside the mitochondria to inside the mitochondria as an example, they have to be folded and unfolded. And so that there's issues with folding of proteins as that we get older. So that's another one. And then a few others, ones, what's thought of as dysbiosis. So changes in our gut microbiota that cause, systemic impact, inflammaging, I mentioned. So there's a few other stragglers, but it's these, things that collectively are just going on in our cells, mitochondria, and then tissues that we can bank on, that those are happening as we get older. And if we're not doing things to counter that, then we'll age less gracefully, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it's helpful to hear kind of the inner workings of what's going on in our cells, because our cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, organs make up systems, and then we get symptoms in these systems. So we have a hormonal problem, or we have even with the organs, we have a liver issue or something like that. But what we're seeing on the outside feels so much more of a macro scale of what we're noticing, these symptoms showing up. So when we see going down to this microscopic level, looking at the cells, looking at mitochondria and how the individual components and the cells are behaving, it makes a lot more sense how, if that's not working, that it would cause sort of systemic issues or these issues wherever this is happening. So when we have a lot of senescent cells, how does it show up in this aging process? Is it just like, oh, we get wrinkles, or is there a specific type of way that it manifests?
Yeah. So really, I think I alluded to earlier that many of the things we think of with aging have senescent cells in the background. So yeah, like skin, joints are really common. So it like going back in time, it used to be thought that the three types of cells most likely to become senescent were immune cells. So, anything to do with immune issues, which are common, right? One of the classic things with aging is older people don't respond as efficiently to vaccinations, as an example. They don't create as much learning from it, as much antibody response, right? That's often thought of as seroconversion. So, but, immune system aging, part of that is because more and more of those cells have become senescent. Another type of cell was fibroblast. And so fibroblasts are a connective tissue cells. So, the underlying the skin, but also, in our joints, around all the organs, right? Like fibroblasts are everywhere. And they were connective tissue. They were connects things to each other. And so those as well. And then the third type would be endothelial cells. And that's what lines our vessels, our circulatory system. But now it's known that, really all cell types can become senescent. It used to be thought neurons couldn't because they don't divide. And one of the, reasons cells become senescent, or, original thought reason, was because we don't want them to make new copies. But even neurons can become senescent. So it's really the way I tend to think about it. When cells get stressed, they have a few options, and it depends on how much stress and how much resources they have, which option they can take. So, door number one, if stress is mild and they've got, lots of resilience, is they'll just buff up their defenses. They'll make more things like glutathione and antioxidants to make sure they're tougher for, when that stress happens again. But if stress is more than that, they're going to take on some damage, which it's fine. Like they can repair some DNA. They can do something called autophagy that cleans up proteins that get damaged. So, if the stress isn't so much that the cell's not repairable anymore, they'll try to fix itself. But if stress is more than that, then that's when something like senescence would happen, because there's enough damage that the cell shouldn't be allowed to make new copies. Or if maybe even more damage, the cell just bypasses everything and kicks the bucket right away. So depending on that combination of the degree of stress, the type of stress, and maybe how much resources the cell had, it can walk through any of these doors. But what we know with aging is it tends to walk through this cellular senescence door much more frequently.
Oh, wow. So it's stress that could cause a cell to become senescent. What sort of stressors could do that?
So when they study it in labs, really all kinds, like inadequacy of nutrients, ionizing radiation. A lot of times they'll study this in cell cultures. Um, um, Extremes of temperature, things that would impair mitochondrial function or damage DNA directly. And so, my sense is that really anything that would cause us stress on a whole body level is very likely to be causing ourselves stress on a cellular level.
Yeah.
And so, if we have a much more stress-filled life, we're probably creating more of these zombie cells, no matter what our age would be.
Yeah, I'd imagine blue light, EMFs, probably some
Yeah.
of the drivers there. So is there anything besides stress that could cause a cell to become senescent?
Yeah, so well, originally the idea was the telomere attrition, right? Like things that would cause DNA to be, damaged or in jeopardy. And so think of that as replicative senescence, but
Right.
almost everything else is in the premature stress-induced category. So, meaning that long before a cell would have short telomeres, it's already enacted this cellular senescence program because of some degree of stress that it wasn't able to deal with. So stress would be I think, the main driver of, and by this particularly things that stress cells. And as I
Yeah.
said, they tend to be the same things that stress us. So
Yeah. So how now I'm thinking I'm 38 and I'm at the beginning, looking 40 in the face. And so I'm starting to think about aging. And so how do we get rid of these senescent cells? Is there a way to prevent them? I think that prevention by reducing stressors, doing all sorts of healthy habits, monitoring your environment, healthy nutrition. But is there anything that we can do to prevent or get rid of these cells so they don't take up precious space?
yeah, let's start more on the prevention end. And
Okay.
before we do that, just for the listeners, the whole field of excitement over senescent cells. So senescent cells have been known about for about 5 decades, but
Huh.
in 2011 they did some, like, basically created genes in a animal that would cause senescent cells to be found and removed. And what they found in that experiment is those animals aged way better. And so that became almost a tipping point where, like, like before we just thought, oh, they had to do with telomeres and and like all of a sudden, okay, maybe these play a bigger role. So it's only been in really the last 12 or 13 years that there's been a lot of emphasis on senescent cells. So that's one. Two is they're hard to measure. Like you have to do
Mm,
tissue biopsies and look at them and really know what you're doing. So that limits some research, because that's one that's very hard to do in humans, and it's need the capabilities to do that well and be smart enough to identify senescent cells in animals. So that said, two of the things that are definitely known to prevent them would be things I'm sure you've talked about to your audience maybe many times. One is exercise,
mhm.
and exercise specifically seems to do it in muscle tissue, which makes sense, right? If we're like, um, you know, most adaptations in the body and the brain are tissue specific. In the brain, they're often region specific, right? Like depending on
Yeah.
the part of the brain being used. And so exercise will act to help prevent the accumulation of senescent cells with aging, but specifically in muscle tissues. And then calorie restriction has been the main other thing studied that also seems to really slow the accumulation. Um, some of the other things that go with calorie restriction, like intermittent fasting, may or may not, it hasn't been studied, but what intermittent fasting does really well is it helps upregulate autophagy. And
Mhm.
if you repair damage inside the cell, it's less likely to become senescent, right? So it would make sense to me that the things known to support autophagy would also be preventive. So those would be the two main ways known to date.
Okay, that's helpful because those are already things that many of my clients are doing. I wouldn't say as much necessarily calorie restriction, potentially a little bit more glucose control type things. And I'm sure hopefully that could play a role as well. Do you know do you know if high blood sugar, high insulin, insulin resistance could drive more of these senolytic cells?
It hasn't been looked at, but again, my
Mhm.
guess would be yes, right? Anything that's causing, that would cause some degree of mitochondrial stress, and
Yes,
mitochondrial dysfunction, is definitely one of the things that can
right.
cause cells to become senescent. So I would, like, my intuition would be, yeah, that for sure
Mhm.
would. And calorie restriction, since you brought it up, like calorie
Mhm.
restriction, it's easy, well, relatively easy to starve an animal and calorie restrict them. It's really hard for us to live the rest of our lives hungry. So
Yeah.
it's not a particularly doable or actionable. Where the more intermittent fastings or doing other things to make sure our response to what we eat is better are more
Yeah.
more sustainable strategies.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the
So
new
that would
strategies.
be
Oh,
the
sorry.
prevention. But what happened in 2015 is scientists at Mayo Clinic and Scripps Institute of Aging got together and said, okay, this was really cool what they did with modifying genes, but I wonder if there's any compounds that if we gave to an animal would cause a senescent cell to finally go through apoptosis, to finally like
Mm.
disintegrate and fall apart. And they found two in 2015 and published a paper about it. And they called compounds that did that senolytics. So in 2015, that term senolytics was birthed, and what that means, it's things that basically help the senescent cells finally go through that dying off process that they should have gone through a long time ago. And since then, really, research has exploded because now all of a sudden there is something that might be done to help our body remove these.
Yeah. So, how do these senolytics work?
So they tend to work on nutrient sensing pathways or on the proteins that. So think of like inside a cell at any point in time, it's should I live or should I die, right? It's toggling between those two choices. And there's certain proteins that like vote yes, some that vote no. So what happens in a senescent cell is that a whole bunch of them have voted no. No, we're not going away. We're cool. We're going to hang out indefinitely. And so some senolytic compounds work directly on those proteins, trying to shift the balance. So you get, the no votes go down, the yes votes go up, and all of a sudden the cell's like, oh, okay, I can finally go through apoptosis. So that would
Wow.
be, one group of ones work on that. Some other senolytics work more on what's thought of as nutrient sensing. So, nutrient sensing would be how a cell would sense, as an example, the amount of sugar in its environment or the amount of protein, right? So cells are wired to really be tuned in to the environment around them and then change their behavior accordingly. So nutrient sensing is a big part of how, and many of the plant compounds that are senolytic, things like quercetin and ficitin, luteolin, like really intense polyphenols found in plants, work on that nutrient sensing. And what happens with the nutrient sensing, it's almost like they sense that the environment, when it goes way higher in polyphenols, isn't such a great environment to sustain them. And so they decide to finally disintegrate, right? And then be
Mm.
reused, right? So, like, that's another part. And then some others, like there's a compound called piperlongamine that's from Ayurvedic plant, long pepper, that works in a completely different way on something like a pathway related to antioxidant defenses. So different compounds play in differently, but you can kind of think in a big picture, it's about sensing the environment and responding. And if the environment looks impoverished, cells are more likely to kick the bucket. And a lot of polyphenols in the diet tend to do that when there's a big change in them.
Y- Yeah. So, my mind is going to, okay, so we want to make the environment seem that these cells need to die, but how do we work? How do we take these sort of compounds then?
Yeah, so there's a old physiological law. It's called Weber-Flexner law, but your audience won't remember that. But it has to do with our senses are designed off proportional change, not of quantities of things. And so, the story I would usually tell is, imagine you go into a completely dark closet and close the door, and now light one candle. You probably notice a big difference, right?
Yeah.
Now imagine you go into that same closet, but there's already 99 candles lit, and you light that one additional candle. Are you going to notice as big a change?
No.
No, maybe no difference, right? And so
Yeah.
one candle doesn't mean anything. It's always the proportion of change, right? That almost a ratio of change. And when you think of even the things that you're passionate about, like blood sugar, things like leptin and insulin, right? Like all those, it's always the same. It's not the amount of something, it's how it changes that causes it to be sensed, right? So, blood sugar, if it, was like, say, fasting a certain level, went up, a certain degree, that will cause one like response. But now if it's, say, fasting, 20 points higher and goes up, the proportion of change changes, right? And it's how things change proportionally that allows our cells to respond, because cells have receptors, which are their eyes and ears, right? So, like, long story short, when we do high amounts of these things like polyphenols, the only time evolutionarily we would have had even remotely those levels would be during famines, when people are eating, making soup out of tree bark and leaves, anything to fill their stomach, right? And so that's why I think a lot of these plant polyphenols, when taken in really high amounts for just a couple of days, create that big change, and cells are wired, just like our vision and hearing, to respond to big proportional changes. So the way senolytics are approached is take a high dose of senolytic compounds for a couple of days and then take a vacation from them for a bit.
That makes so much sense. Okay, that makes total sense. So who should use these? Could I use it at my age? Like, is there, a person who this wouldn't be good for?
Yeah, I tend to think of senolytic compounds as, there would be very, very little reason to expect someone in their 20s has any significant accumulation of senescent cells, unless something has occurred where they have undergone a lot of stress. That would likely be a cellular stress. So, like, as an example, chemotherapy, one of the mechanisms, and one of the reasons chemotherapy works, is it causes cancer cells to go through apoptosis, right? That's a main mechanism of many chemotherapeutic drugs, right? They're causing an immense amount of stress on cancer cells, but a byproduct of that is they're causing an immense amount of stress on healthy cells. And so some of those become senescent. So someone that's undergone chemotherapy, at some point in their life, would probably have more senescent cells than normally for their age. And that would be true for many things if stress was crazy intense, right?
Yeah.
And so, but in general, the way I tend to think about it is senescent cells are going to accumulate exponentially with age. So I'm 62, so substantially older than you are. Someone in my age range, it would be expected to have senescent cells accumulated past the amount that they're causing problems, likely in multiple tissues. And if someone's already, as an example, having issues with their joints, then you can almost bank at my age that it's because senescent cells there have accumulated to a degree that they're contributing to that. But if someone was younger and started to have joint things, you could probably, comfortably think, oh, senescent cells in that tissue for them may have accumulated unevenly, meaning they have like higher amounts than they should at that age. And so the way I think about it, so say someone your age, I would say, senolytics would be more an analogy I gave to our head of marketing when we first created the Qualia senolytic was, and she's a gardener for other gardeners listening. I said, it's like pruning a plant, right? Plants are periodically going to get some yellow leaves. Yellow leaves, think of those as the senescent cells. A yellow leaf should ideally fall off the plant. Sometimes they don't. Good gardener comes in and just prunes them away. And if the good gardener doesn't prune the plant, then the yellow leaves can invite more pests. They can use up nutrients, and all of a sudden, 1 or 2 yellow leaves becomes, 5 or 6 becomes more, and then the whole plant struggles. So, so for someone in their mid 30s to 50, I would think of, senolytics would be more like the periodic gardener that's going to come in and prune these out of your tissues before they accumulate to an extent that they're starting to contribute to some dysfunction in your tissues.
Yeah, that's so helpful and very interesting about this idea of pulsing it on and then taking it away, because I do like things that mimic nature, right? We have to look to nature for a lot of our answers. So you recently helped formulate the Qualia senolytics. So what you mentioned that there were certain senolytic compounds that they found in research. So walk us through and tell us a little bit about how you formulated this and why.
Yeah, so the I mentioned that the Mayo and Scripps researchers originally identified two
Mm-hmm.
compounds as senolytics. So one of those is quercetin, which is found. Onions would usually be the source that you hear is a good source of quercetin, but specifically it concentrates, like most polyphenols do, in the parts we throw away from onion.
Mm,
The
yeah.
parts like it's the outer skin. Like polyphenols are plant stress compounds. They tend to accumulate where a plant would be most stressed, which is where it interacts more with the world outside of it. So
Mm-hmm.
quercetin was one. And then the other one they identified was something called dasatinib. And dasatinib is a medication used most commonly for certain types of cancer. And so, and what they found in that original research that was interesting is quercetin was senolytic in some compounds, like endothelial cells, but not in fat tissue. And dasatinib was senolytic in fat tissue, but not in endothelial cells. So something can be senolytic, but that doesn't mean it's senolytic everywhere in the
Across the
body,
board, yeah.
in all tissues. And so what was cool is they thought, oh, what happens if we stack these together? And what they found is that stack, that combination of the two, was much more effective than either on its own. And
Oh.
and then that same group of researchers a few years later decided, okay, well, if one polyphenol was senolytic, let's screen a whole bunch of other ones and see if any of those are as well. And they found fisetin, which you'll often see strawberries a good source, but you'd have to literally eat a boatload of strawberries to get a lot of fisetin. So that was found out to be even a better senolytic than quercetin, and actually was active in fat tissue in that original work. So, and then luteolin, curcumin, were other ones they identified in that research. I mentioned something called piperlongamine earlier. Other researchers discovered that was senolytic, and that one actually looks like it mimics some of the cellular things that dasatinib would do. Soy isoflavones are another thing that seem like it mimicked that. So, the plant compounds actually are pretty cool because they're not as aggressive, right? They tend, as I mentioned, to work more on these nutrient sensing. So they're not really, they're more, the way I would think of it, getting a cell to change its mind than directly forcing it to change its mind. So they
Right,
tend to
with the
be,
votes.
yeah,
That's how I think about it now. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And
Very
so,
cool.
yeah, so what we did at Qualia was we put a bunch of these different ones together. The other thing is something can be senolytic, but you have to take enough of it to get that effect. And the way I think of it is akin to temperature, right? Like a sauna is beneficial, but that doesn't mean 70 degrees heat is going to do much for you, right? Like you have to do the thing and have enough of doing it. And so
Yeah.
that's what we did. At Qualia, we put together 9 of these different plant compounds in high doses, and then have people take them typically 2 days a month. And we've done a few different studies on that product since originally putting the idea together even before we launched the product. And then it's been on the market about 2 years. So we've done one placebo study, and we're in the midst of a second one.
Oh, nice. What are the results from the study so far? Are you able to share?
Yeah, yeah. And I mentioned joint tissues being one of the areas that
Mm-hmm.
originally, because of fibroblasts being, an area that's very well known to be impacted by senescent cells. And there's even been research in animals where they infuse senescent cells in joints, and they can basically create old joints just by doing that. So senescent
Oh.
cells in joints. And so what we decided to do was look in that area. So we recruited people that already had some degree of issues with their joints, and those often, discomfort being a big one, but challenges walking comfortably up and down stairs or getting in and out of cars. Like those are thought of as issues with daily living. So we recruited those people, and we had some take placebo. We had some take the Qualia senolytic, and as I mentioned, this is a 2-day thing. So we had them take it for 2 days, have a vacation from it, and do that 2 days on vacation 2 more times. So altogether, they would have taken the Qualia senolytic for 6 days over about 5 weeks, and we saw about 65% improvement in issues with joints, and which was, of course, way better than what occurred in the placebo group. So, yeah, and then we also saw about a 65% increase in people's ratings of the energy they had, which was more than double what we saw. Like there's always some placebo response, so there was some improvement in energy, but it was about twice as much in the people that took this product. Yeah,
That's great. I mean, joint pain, my parents recently retired, and my dad's down in playing pickleball all the time, and he's like, Dan, my knees, I got no cartilage in my knees. I'm like, I feel like we should be able to do something to help you here. So I've given him BPC 157, which has really helped him, but this sounds like another thing that he's going to be getting in the mail. So yeah, eager to help out my parents with their health and just feeling better, because when your joints hurt, you can't do things, and then you stop moving as much, and that's going to impact your entire overall health. So these things are really, really powerful, and just getting some energy back, that's great. So anything else that you want to share about the dosing and why this like pulsing on and off is important? I feel like how do I explain? So how many of the capsules do you need to take?
Yeah.
Can we get this from food, or can we not? Because it's like we're, taking like a huge amount. You mentioned how many strawberries you would need to eat in order to get the amount of this. So is it something that we can also find in food, or this serves a very specific extra purpose?
Yeah, we'd find some of these compounds in foods or herbs, right? Like turmeric has curcumin, but the amount needed to be taken isn't achievable, even remotely achievable through diet. So go back to that, candle dark closet analogy. Maybe foods would have the equivalent of 1 candle, and we need to light 100, and that wouldn't even be fair. It's a much higher dose than that to be senolytic.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. It's that threshold that it's because I feel like polyphenols, what I know about them is that they're good for your gut, but can you explain that a little bit more? I don't have a full grasp on that.
Yeah, so polyphenols are a category of plant compounds, and they're usually thought of as plant defense compounds, but think of them as things plants make more of when they're stressed to respond to their environment, right? So resveratrol would be an example of a polyphenol, and grapes will make more resveratrol. And given what I said about onions, where do you think they'll make it?
In the skin.
In the skin.
Yeah.
Seeds will have some, the stem.
And that's why they would talk about red wine over white wine, because red wine is made with the skins.
Right.
So that's why it has resveratrol. Okay, got it.
Yeah, more and so all of these things tend to when the environment is more stressful, plants make more polyphenols to help protect themselves from stress. So the stress for grapes might be it's not enough moisture. Maybe it's too much sunlight. Maybe it's pests, insect pests, right, that are trying to eat nearby. And same like capsaicin, the spicy thing from chilies. Like plants will make more of that if pests are nearby on other plants. So plants are smart. They're trying to adapt and survive, and they make more polyphenols when needed. And when we eat polyphenols, some people believe since we co-evolved with plants, it would cause our cells to use that information to also make decisions about what we think the environment's going to be like. So, if, as an example, we're eating more, polyphenols that would have increased evolutionarily when there was more of a drought, and we eat more of those, then our cells might start to think, okay, I better prepare for a future where food isn't quite as abundant. And
That
so
makes total sense.
then preparation's often, okay, what can I sacrifice? What's the least useful thing? And senescent cells would be less useful than healthy cells, right? So it's that signaling, right? We often think mechanistically, oh, like this does that, but so much of everything that goes on in our body and brain and metabolism is geared towards predicting the future. So like one of my favorite metabolic health weight studies was Biosphere 2. Is that one you're
I'm not
familiar with?
familiar. No.
So before your time, but Biosphere 2 was this dome out in the desert in Tucson that I think it was 8 scientists went and lived in for 2 years back in early 1990s timeframe. And they expected that they would be able to grow a certain amount of food, and they weren't able to quite grow that much. And so, between what they brought in and what they could grow, they were chronically slightly calorie deprived for that 2 years. So the first 6 months they lost, and one of them was a doctor, actually a really famous, the doctor that wrote the books in the 80s on calorie restriction happened to be the doctor that went in.
Uh-huh.
But they, all lost weight. Some things like, blood sugar, cholesterol levels, those look better. Of course, they were really hungry. And about 6 months in, they stopped losing weight. So they kind of plateaued at that point. Because it wasn't like they were starving. They were getting 17 or 1,800 calories a day. And when they came out, they measured all the blood work again. They could now eat as much as they wanted. And within, I think it might have been 4 weeks or 6 weeks, it was pretty quickly. They regained all the weight that they lost, but they regained all of it as body fat. They didn't regain the muscle. And, things that looked healthy, like the blood sugar and the cholesterol, actually were worse after that than they had been before, right? So like what weight researchers would call that is dieting-induced adiposity. Like it's a super common finding is that the adaptation to chronic calorie deprivation tends to be we worsen metabolic health and we pack more fat on. And my story, because so much of what the brain and our whole system does is try to predict the future, is that whatever part regulates body fat, let's call it the brain for now, said, oh, I don't know when these idiots are going to go starve themselves in the desert for 2 years again. Next time I'll be better prepared, and better prepared looks like more body fat in that context, right? So everything,
Yes.
we're trying to do, our brain is definitely a prediction engine, but on a cellular level, they're also trying to predict the future. Same like, lifting weights to get muscle mass. Our muscles, typically will get bigger if we lift weight. But part of the reason they are is because they're anticipating that we're going to lift weights again, and they want to
Again.
be more ready for it. So everything's always about predicting the future. And, and when you start thinking of that, whether it's glucose, insulin, like all of these are things that maybe they're misfiring a little. Maybe, the things we did in the past have caused, like the people in Biosphere 2, our body to be making a prediction that's not the best one right now.
Yeah, I love learning about this stuff because I am learning a ton about light and circadian rhythms. And I was learning from someone how when life on Earth began in the oceans, there were, let's say, sea creatures down there, only the blue light kind of reached to a certain depth. And so the fish who had sensors to pick up this light would have this evolutionary advantage. And then the fish who were able to sort of have these clock genes to predict when that light was coming, like, oh, the light's almost gone. That means I better hide, or that means the light's almost here. I better get ready to go get food, or, whatever that is, that we always have been that idea of being able to predict what's going to happen next. That's something that I could understand how humans would have that sort of thing too. And yeah, that makes sense from that circadian type or circannual type.
We even like what you would normally see in research is people that eat regular, meaning their meal times are pretty similar. Typically have better metabolic health, even if they ate the same food as another group that's eating less predictably. And part of the reason it takes a lot of things have to be lined up for digestion and metabolism to work well. And if that can be predicted, then better things happen than when it's chaotic, right? So,
Yeah.
and circadian rhythms are tied into some of that, but just in general, when we make it easier for our brain and body to predict the future, better things happen than when they struggle to do that. And at a cellular
Yeah.
level, it's the same. And, like I said, a lot of why I think these polyphenols, when you do the large doses of them, but just briefly, like, you don't, one of the things, like we go back to vision and hearing, if we hold the same noise constant or hold something in front of our retina and don't move it, our brain will start to ignore it pretty quickly. We develop, you think of it as resistance, right?
Yeah.
To it, right? Just like insulin resistance, where there's plenty of that signal outside of cells and tissues, but the receptors are ignoring it fundamentally, right? So we always want to have the right proportional change to things. And
Yes.
so, like, taking a low amount of, like, eating onions every day is unlikely to be senolytic. What causes it to be senolytic is the massive change, and then going back to the very low amount that would be in the diet.
That makes so much sense. And, this idea that nature is not usually the same. there's, highs and lows and hot and cold and feast and famine. And this idea of, I think a lot of people want to do the same exact thing every single day because they just want to make sense of it all. It's a lot of things to think about. And so the idea that we would pulse something on makes so much sense to me. And that idea that the degree of change causes the body to start paying attention. So I also got another supplement from Qualia, and it's NAD plus.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if you could explain, I know that NAD plus is helpful for longevity, but I don't really know anything else about it. So do you have time to share a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. So NAD does a lot of things in cells, but you can think of it as the big three. So it's needed to make ATP, right? Which then, that's the energy that runs everything. It's needed to fuel antioxidant defenses. So that when I said that first door number one when cells are stressed is let's upregulate our defenses. So NAD is needed for that. And then it's also involved in repairing DNA damage, so that if door number two happens and they took on some damage, NAD plays a role in that. And so those are like three main things. And one of the most preeminent researchers on NAD is someone named Dr. Brenner. And what he would generally say is NAD is super important when cells undergo metabolic stress. So, that would be exactly what you and your listeners think, right? Like things that would, cause issues with its metabolism, like, sugar, too much sugar overwhelming it, but, other stress as well. And so the way I think about, why would you want to boost NAD? It's so that when cells are stressed, because they are going to be stressed, like there's, no getting around that, they have more resources so they can walk through door number one or two and not go into the cellular senescence or dying prematurely door. Right. So
so this counts as a little bit of a preventative as well to prevent the senescent cells.
Yeah. And then the other thing is I mentioned that, and there's like a reciprocal interaction. So senescent cells, I mentioned, like they're living, they actually consume a lot of resources, just like a yellow leaf on a plant will be consuming that. And they consume like more than their fair share of NAD. And then I also mentioned senescent cells can then secrete things and cause healthy cells to become senescent. So NAD decreases with age, but part of the reason is because senescent cells are accumulating and consuming more of it.
These zombies are taking up all our resources. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So interesting. So you had great personal results with Qualia NAD plus. Can you share those with us?
Yeah, we did so I personally, so for the listeners, my title is Vice President of Product Development, but just think of me as like the mad scientist that puts things together and then tries them before we would ever sell them to the public. So
I love that.
So when we first put some together, just enough for a few people to take, and I did my NAD levels before and after 20 days, and mine went up 156%, which is a big increase. And what I had done in advance of that, as I'd gone off anything that might have NAD boosters for about 45 days. And then another biohacker, Quantified Bob. I don't know if you would know of
I
him.
feel like I've heard the name. Yeah,
Yeah.
but
So
I don't know him personally.
he was willing to take a month's supply and do his before and after. His went up about 98%. So we both had, what I would think of as above average increases, but the average in what we've seen in our placebo control study is about 75% increase over
Well,
a month.
well, that's great to help prevent these senolytic cells. And then we have the 2 days out of a month is that how often you take it? 2 days a month for the senolytics?
Yeah, I always say Qualia senolytic the first weekend of the month. So I just took it. As we're
I
recording,
know
I just took
I'm
it
out of mine. I need to get
a
more.
couple days ago.
Yeah. Okay. That's how I was like, okay, I'm going to remember by doing it at the beginning of the month. So, yeah, that first weekend of the month, that makes so much sense. So, and then we can take that NAD daily
Yeah, yeah.
to bump up those levels. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's and I think NAD might have a big circadian tie-in. So I haven't seen this talked about much. For sure, there's a circadian rhythm to NAD in our blood. It tends to like peak somewhere early afternoon. But there was one animal study where they did NAD boosters, the equivalent of at the beginning of their day or at the end of their day. So think of it as like our breakfast or our dinner. And one of the commonalities of the early NAD boosting research was that NR or NMN, things that are NAD boosters, improved metabolic health. Glucose, insulin, lipids, things like that. But anyways, what they found in this study is when they gave the NAD boosters at the beginning of the day, it improved metabolic health. But when they gave it at the end of the day, it worsened it. And so because there's, again, animal study may not translate to humans, but a lot of circadian things, if that exists in animals, as you mentioned, right? Like we evolved from like all those predictive medicines things evolved even way before mice, right? We just
Yeah.
inherited them. So, my bias is until, proven otherwise, it's better just to do all your NAD boosters first thing in your day. So,
Okay. Yeah. So interesting. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm learning about that's blowing me away is that we're just designed to do things better at certain times of the day or the month or the year. And to when we honor that, when we can sync our bodies with that, big things happen. So yeah, like we talked about time restricted eating, and I recommend to people to eat earlier in the day because that's when we're more insulin sensitive. And I always say when the sun goes down, insulin clocks out. So it's not the best time to be, we don't want to be backloading all of our calories. So love that. So what is next for Qualia? I love that you guys are coming out with these really cool products. It seems like you're the brains behind it. I'm sure one of the brains, but one of the primary brains for sure.
Yeah, we've got some other really smart people that contribute a lot,
Sounds
and
like
then we've got a lot of what I think of as friends of the family that I can reach out to and get their thoughts on things. But we'll be launching a magnesium product coming up sometime. I think right now it's scheduled for towards the end of July. That will have 9 different types of magnesium with trace minerals. And I think the trace minerals part is so underappreciated with magnesium because like how much magnesium evolutionarily do you think we got from water that we drank? Like what percent of a daily amount?
what percent from the water we drank? Maybe, I don't know, 50, a lot?
No, well, I mean,
Not that much?
no, like 20, but
Less?
that's still a lot. Like 20,
Okay.
and so much water now is kind of impoverished, right? It was purified, minerals were stripped
Yeah.
out, and so, I like in our food, magnesium always would have been from trace minerals in plants because plants are the best source of magnesium, and then mineral-rich water we would have drank, and now we drink disproportionately purified water to get rid of other things, but we also lose out on the magnesium and all the trace minerals. So the way I think of like magnesium, the way nature intended it is magnesium with trace minerals. So we have
Love that.
70 plus trace minerals from 2 different
Fulvic? Fulvic and
not
humic?
we're not using fulvic and humic in part. I mean, those would be like a source of
Yeah.
minerals, but we're using seawater derived minerals, right?
Nice.
Because
Nice.
that's we, like our cells and mitochondria, evolved in that environment to use and be surrounded by
Yeah.
those minerals. So
Yeah, I was just saying that today because I there's a brand of plant-based minerals that I love with the fulvic and humic, and they're like, well, should I just do these or should I do the salt? Because I have people remineralize their water as well with magnesium and trace minerals, and I'm like, I feel like we need both because our cells came from the ocean, and so that ability to keep that salinity and all those minerals within us, and then the food we used to eat used to have these fulvic and humic substances on them from the dirt, and now our soils are destroyed. So yeah, mineral deficiency is just such a rampant thing that you may not feel. It's just I have brain fog, I don't sleep that great. So excited to get the new magnesium product too.
yeah, and then our original product, Qualia Mind, is
Mm.
and that product has been out about. I mean, I've worked for Qualia for 6 years, and just before I started is when it launched. So say 7 years. We decided to go back and look at other cognitive ingredients, and then see if we could build a more effective version. And for us, that means that people would notice more motivation, energy, focus. Those would be when we think of like Qualia Mind. That's the big. I call that the big three. And we
Yeah.
did a study where we combined the current mind. If a customer goes to the qualialife.com website and buys Qualia Mind, they'll get what I think of as OG
Hmm.
Qualia. But we were able to come up with a recipe that was one fewer capsule and more effective. So that's scheduled to launch around Labor Day, which is exciting. So
Yeah, a lot of good stuff coming up. As an entrepreneur, I need my brain to be on all the time for podcasting and video and content creation and emails and all the things. So I'm eager to try all the new things that are coming down the pipeline. So thanks so much for being here, and we will link everything in the show notes. But it's Qualia, Qualia. It's Qualia.com.
qualialife.com.
Life.com. Okay, perfect. So everything will be linked in the show notes. Thanks so much for being here and taking the time to share with my audience all about how to age gracefully.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, absolutely.